The Dalai Lama said, love and compassion are necessity, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. I totally agree with this. I do believe we are at an inflection point on this planet where we need more and more compassion. And obviously, when we look out in the world, we're challenged there with a lot of callousness and even cruelty that we see. And so part of what we're really focused on is how do we spread compassion, particularly towards and from boys and men. And obviously, girls and women and gender fluid people are very significant in here. And our focus is really about boys and men. Welcome to the first Men and Boys Compassion Initiative public event. I'm Daniel Ellenberg, and I'm the founder of this initiative, and I'm really excited and happy to be involved with so many great people, inclusive of all the people in this panel today. After I share a few reflections, I'm going to introduce the panelists. They'll have a chance to present in their particular areas. I may ask a question or two when they're done, and then we'll move on to the next person. After we're done with all the panelists' presentations, then we're going to open it to Q&A. Now, as you're listening, you may have particular questions come up, and if you're like me, you may not remember those questions later on, so you may want to write them down for yourself. When we reach that point of Q&A, you'll have two different ways of asking questions. Obviously, one is in chat, and the other is if you want to speak yours to us with your video showing at that time. If you do, know that you will be in the video, and this is going to go public. It's going to be on YouTube. It's going to be disseminated in the world. The Men and Boys Compassion Initiative mission is to educate both professionals and the public about what defines a strong, compassionate man, while also promoting compassion towards and from boys and men, including themselves, the power of self-compassion. We focus on elevating the caring and sharing aspects of men and boys, while also minimizing the dominating and callous ones. I'm happy to say that we're affiliated with GCC, Global Compassion Coalition, who is hosting this event. My dear friend, Rick Hansen, is the founder of that, who is listening to us in Switzerland right now. And the Global Compassion Coalition, for those of you who don't know, is a wonderful new nonprofit that began not that many months ago and is really scaling quickly. I really welcome all of you who are interested to get involved. You can be a sponsor, you can get involved with different groups, including the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative. We're also affiliated with the American Psychological Association Division on Men and Masculinities, as well as APA Science, where we're really looking at how do we create a world that's more gender, open, in the sense that people, men, women, gender fluid people can express and be the full range of their humanness and not be limited to these old prescribed archaic roles. The time has come to change. Now, the reality is males are not doing well. I mean, you look out in the world, all the metrics, they don't look good. Men are committing suicide at almost 4 times the rate. The mental health, the physical health issues are daunting. The educational challenges are beyond belief. If you're interested in learning more about even some of the statistics, I recommend looking at our pages on the GCC website. Also, a wonderful new book that's come out called Boys and Men by Richard Reeves really goes into some of the dynamics that are occurring. And it's particularly true for boys and men of color. We really need to elevate ourselves to get better. Now, the time has really come to have these conversations about boys and men. Pretty much everywhere you look, I'm sure you've seen in magazines, in newspapers, in conversations. The conversations about boys and men is everywhere these days. And the question is, who is filling the void? One of my biggest concerns is that people like Andrew Tate, who those of you who don't know is really, he's a true misogynist, and he's kind of the antithetical to everything that we really believe in. But he presents himself as a very confident character, and young boys who really don't know how to grow into manhood see him as a role model. We need to present positive, compassionate male role models, because if we don't, the void will be filled. Carl Jung said, nature abhors a void. and where there's a void, demons rush in. And we want to have angels, not necessarily in a religious sense, but in a sense that bringing out our more angelic, caring, kind, compassionate natures. And the reality is that compassion helps guys overcome social pressures to avoid and deny vulnerabilities. I've often thought that the linchpin that holds together what we would call rigid, restrictive masculinity, in the common press is often called toxic masculinity. We don't use those terms. But this kind of masculinity is predicated on two different areas. One is having to prove masculinity, as if somehow that has to be earned or owned in some way. We don't believe that at all. And the second is based on a denial of vulnerability. And the reality is, hey, we're all vulnerable. The ultimate vulnerability is death, right? And to deny the fact that we are vulnerable beings in a pretty challenging world is delusional. And we want to really move beyond that, because we really need to develop more prosocial attitudes and behaviors. So essentially, like, our intention is to help transform the male paradigm, to help change systems, structures, and contexts that accentuate rigid, restrictive masculinity. And I'm going to make a call later on, but we really invite your involvement in our work. There are a lot of different organizations who we're aligned with, and we're really looking to collaborate, because if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes much more than that to change the paradigm. And essentially, that's what we need to do. So with that, I would like to introduce Paul Gilbert. Paul is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Derby and a visiting professor at the University of Queensland. He's an evolutionary psychologist and a founder of the Compassionate Mind Foundation and Compassion Focused Therapy. He's also an awesome guy. I've had the deep privilege, I got a smile out of Paul. Yeah, I've had the deep privilege of having many conversations with Paul over the last probably 3/4 of the year. And Paul, you've entered my heart, and I'm super psyched to be with you, and I welcome you, and take it away. It's all yours now. Can't hear you, Paul. Paul, you're on mute.
Thanks so much. Yes, I think I'll leave now while the going's good. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you and show you some slides. So here we go. Oops, let's go back to the beginning. Okay, so I hope you can see all this. So really, I'm going to look at the evolved challenges of masculinities for compassion. And I think one of the key things we have to think about, which Daniel sort of mentioned, is this concept of toxic masculinities. But I prefer to think of toxic competitiveness. And I'll explain why I think that's a preferable way of thinking about these problems. The second thing is, as a researcher in compassion, I'm very interested in the inhibitors of compassion. There's a lot of research showing what facilitates compassion, but in our view, if you don't deal with the inhibitors, then whatever you try to do, you'll get tripped up by them. So this is quite important to distinguish between what facilitates compassion, but also what will get in the way. Now, Daniel mentioned briefly this concept of the masculinity, the needing to prove masculinity and so forth, and that is obviously going to be one of the issues of inhibition. The other thing I would argue is that we need to understand our minds, where they came from, how they operate, what motivates us, because a mind that doesn't understand itself is at risk of being callous, cruel, and dangerous. And we'll look at that in a moment. So there we are. We all know that we're evolved. And the key drivers of evolution are survival and reproduction. So you and I, all of us, have brains which have been built by DNA to survive and reproduce. And that means that they have all kinds of different motivational systems within them. So this is a book I wrote back in 89. Yeah, it was 89. Highlighting the fact that we have these different motivational systems which have been plumbed in by evolution. So we identified 5, which were caregiving, care eliciting, cooperating, competing, and sexuality. Now that, I say we, that was already in the evolutionary literature. And what I was interested in, what the book is about, is how do we engage these motivations safely, helpfully, and competently, rather than unsafely, unhelpfully, and incompetently? Because certainly with people who have mental health problems, they tend to be more on the red side than the green side. The other thing that's quite important is that we can begin to see that if we take a motivational process, we can see that processes such as guilt actually linked to caring behavior, whereas shame is very much to do with competitive behavior. They arise from different motivational systems. What's also important is that we want to be able to distinguish between the prosocial ways of these motivations. There are ways in which are helpful to self and others, but there's also antisocial ways that are not helpful to self and others. We can elicit care in unhelpful ways, become dependent, or we can elicit care in ways that are helpful. And we need to make a distinction between the internal world and the external world. So what is going on inside of males so that they think about themselves, that orientates them to the world, their relationships with themselves, but also their relationships with others. So these are sort of key principles that we need to root our psychology in. So let's have a quick look at the motivational systems, because what's crucial is to understand that motivational systems evolved with physiological underpinnings to help those systems work. And they're based on signal detection and response. So if you're going to have a sexual relationship, then you have to be able to detect a sexual signal and to be able to respond to it. Your brain needs both of them, sender and a receiver, right? At this time of the year, these pigeons are all, the male pigeons are flapping their wings like this, you know. I've tried it with my wife. It doesn't work. I'm so sorry to say. But the key, whoops, where have I gone? The key thing is to understand how our understanding of compassion can help us understand this. Now, we also know that when it comes to competitive behavior, how one individual tries to dominate another, again, we can identify a whole range of physiological systems that can be driven by this. And we also know that when it comes to prosocial behavior, my slides are going too quickly, prosocial behavior, again, there's a whole range of physiological systems which underpin prosocial behavior. Care, as Danny said, care and share. These can be identified. And these are very important, because if we are going to begin to develop compassion in the world, we need to understand how to stimulate these processes, but we also need to understand what gets in the way. Now, in terms of compassion, we define it pretty simply as an algorithm. It's based in caring, where you are sensitive to suffering. You want to approach it rather than dissociate or disengage. Callousness is when we have no interest in it. And of course, cruelty is when we actually want to cause it. So compassion is when we're sensitive to suffering and we want to take action. So you do need the two things, right? If you're only sensitive, but you don't know what to do, or you don't know how to take action, or you're too frightened to take action, then compassion falls over. If you are full of courage or doing something, but you haven't got a clue what you're doing, that's not very good either. So both of these require courage and wisdom. And that's a really important point, because that point is often missed when people talk about compassion. They tend to talk more about love and kindness, which are great. I don't have anything against that. But that's not the root of the compassion that we need in the context today. We need the courage and wisdom to take action to address suffering and the causes of suffering. Whether or not you love people is irrelevant to your dedication to address the causes of suffering, the roots of suffering. And this means that we have to have a biopsychosocial approach. I'm sure most of the audience understand the issue between the links between our biological selves and how our biological selves can be influenced by the social environments in which we live and how they form our attitudes. And ecologies, of course, are very important. We know, for example, that if you'd been born a few thousand years ago in Rome, your attitudes would be very different than they are now. A third of Romans actually were slaves, whereas that hopefully today is not so much the case in New York or wherever Dan is. The other point that's important is that if you were going to produce change, we have to be thinking about changes both at the level of the physiological regulation of emotion in males, the psychological processes of values and beliefs, and the social context in which all those are orchestrated. So you need all three. If you only have one, if you only have two and you lose control of one, then it doesn't work. And we've got research in our in psychotherapy to show that you can change people's values and beliefs, but if they don't change physiologically, they slip back quite quickly. That's on studies of heart rate variability. So we're humans that have a lot of needs, and if those needs are not met, particularly social needs, we're a highly social species from the day we're born to the day we die. we at an interpersonal level, closeness level, do need to be loved and cared for. And if that doesn't happen, then we can run into all kinds of trouble because those physiological systems don't mature in the way that's conducive to compassion. So as Daniel was saying again, we look at how various species engage the environment. They can engage in the environment with different strategies, which one is control and hold. That's a typical dominant subordinate strategy, and the other is care and share. Now, this is quite important because males in particular, but females too, but in slightly different ways, are orientated to compete with each other. This is called intrasexual competition. And in order to stop constant fighting, males have to learn how to submit. Those who win and go up the hierarchy show activity, increased activity confidence, and so on, and they show physiological changes. So winning increases males' testosterone, for example. Those who lose and go down the hierarchy, they have to become wary because now they're in danger of being attacked by dominance. So many animals show these behaviors. Whoops, sorry, going too fast. Oops. Many animals have these capacities for intrasexual competition. In other words, the brain is built for that in these species. And you can see them in various primates as well. And one of the key things to get across is that when the competitive system is on, this is why I want to talk about toxic masculinities, actually, in order to compete, you have to turn off your empathy for the harm that you're doing the other, right? So this is really important, that competitive behavior, the more a culture drives competitive behavior, the less empathy you'll find in that culture. And this is also true with individuals. So what happens is that you don't get this, for example. Sorry, Fred. At certain times of the year, this is a long-horned mountain goat. At certain times of the year when the females secrete pheromones to say, I'm ready for mating, they all start crashing into themselves. Well, they haven't got a clue what they're doing. I'm sorry, I haven't given you a headache. But we can understand what we're doing. We can understand what drives competitiveness, what drives competitiveness between males, what drives the desire to control and hold and so forth. Now, it turns out that, of course, humans are much less orientated to aggressiveness, are much more orientated to attracting, to be desired, to be wanted. This is a relatively old structure for a status seeking. This is much more common for humans. But as we will see, this can be a problem for males because how do you become valued? How do you get chosen? How do you get freely given to? And again, as Danny was saying, the three challenges of mindhood are that what you acquire status for, what you are esteemed for, what you are valued for, what you are accepted for is elusive. And it requires effort. It's achieved. Once it's achieved, it's tenuous, and it has to be confirmed by others. You can't just do it for yourself, because if the group turns against you, then you're in trouble. And I would argue that this is to do with competition for social place. We can say exactly the same thing for competitive motivational systems. And again, many of you will be familiar with this. This is Malik's conformity to masculine norms. And you can see there are things about needing to win, to take risks, to fight. It's pretty, if I say basic primate stuff, you know what I mean. Now, not to show these, in certain cultures, risks, rejections, and being marginalized. And so that's important. And again, as Daniel said, this is a really nice paper, looking at different dimensions of masculinity in terms of how they affect mental health. So what's happened in highly competitive societies is that, unfortunately, the desire to be valued, to make a contribution and so forth, has also fused with this other aspect of competition, which is the desire to be threatened, desire to be threatening. And if you look at a lot of the toxic, what we call toxic masculinities, they're actually toxic competitive strategies because they're based on this idea that toughness is the ability to intimidate. Toughness is the ability to induce fear in those that would challenge you. And we see this in the prisons all the time. We do a lot of work in the prisons, and there are many individuals in the prisons who will only feel safe if they know they can frighten you. And as a therapist, that can be a bit tricky at times. But if they feel they can't threaten you, if you're not frightened of them, then they can feel very unsafe. And that can be improving your ability to stand up and fight, and you're able to intimidate others, that can be an aspect of masculinity, which is really quite awful. And here's a paper that is in Press, and this is looking at various social norms. Now, I'm going to make all of these slides available to you so you can read these at leisure, but the key issue is that what we call toxic masculinity, toxic competitiveness, is all linked to the fear of inferiority, the fear of rejection. Fear drives this whole process, and we need to understand that, because if we don't address the fear that sits underneath toxic masculinity, we're in trouble. We also need to be aware that tribes, groups themselves, can become incredibly toxically competitive. This is some wonderful work by Jim Sindarius and Prato and colleagues. And they've done a lot of work over many years, and they've shown that groups can have these dimensions, which they call social dominance orientation. And the dominance, or this dominance dimension, is characterized by support for overt aggression and oppression, for behaviors are designed to maintain subordination in one or more groups, whereas anti-egalitarian dimensions, there are two dimensions here: dimension of oppression, dimension of anti-egalitarianism. And again, you can see this. So it's not just about masculinities, that is an issue. It's about cultures. It's about the way cultures engage in these behaviors. And if we look at Western cultures have been extraordinarily exploitative of other cultures, extraordinary. I mean, if you think of the slave trade and so forth and so forth. So we are soaked in this concept of that some groups are more superior to other groups. And that has created terrible problems. Humanity is potentially a very nasty species. And until we wake up to this reality, if we keep believing, oh, we're basically nice, really, we all have to love each other, that's, for me, a delusion. Humans are potentially very nasty, very dangerous. We see what's going on in Ukraine right now. That's our history, okay? And if you think about the treatment of women, for example, not good. On the other hand, we do have the potential for an amazing compassionate mind. We are built for it. We have it in our brains. We have this capacity too. And what we need to understand is how that gets suppressed. Because it's the suppression of this side of ourselves that really causes serious problems. Once you start doing this, once you get into competitive behavior, once you get into the need to show you're strong and so forth, you start turning off the green side. That's really, really important. Okay, so what we want to do is turn off that side, obviously. So the key thing then is to highlight the fact that competitive mentalities, when they get going, they can create the problem of downrank, which is where men get caught up when they get into depression and become suicide. They start feeling failures and no good, submissive. But when they get too caught up in toxic uprank, then you end up with the narcissists, the psychopaths, and so forth, and various leaders of country that I won't mention right now. And what you're wanting to do is to switch them over here. So that's the key, really, to understanding what we're trying to do. And the key, just move on here. 2 slides just to finish for you. So what we need to do is to understand then that we have a potential, because evolution has built us into it, to be really nasty. And do not mistake, humans can be incredibly vicious. If you think about our tortures and so on and so on, we are a nasty lot. But if we create the conditions, if we create the backgrounds, if we create the early life experiences, then males and females can actually become incredibly compassionate. And therefore, we need to help people understand the nature of their mind. We need much more education, value the importance of play. Know that play is an extremely important process in childhood, but also later in adulthood for setting positive emotions and stimulating prosocial behavior. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these because of time, but you can read them. I'll make them available to you. All of that stuff. What we know, what our research has shown, that when males start to feel safe, when they don't feel under threat, then they can begin to look at their vulnerabilities. Then they can begin to develop cooperative relationships, and then they take an interest in prosocial behavior. I mean, not everybody, obviously, but these are dimensions, but that's what we need to do. And so finally, then, just to finish off with the slide I mentioned before, compassion is when we develop the courage and the wisdom to say, we will address the causes of suffering. We will understand suffering. We will address the causes, and we will develop the wisdom to do that. One of the wonderful things that Dan and the group and the work that they're doing at the coalition is that we're dedicated to that. We're dedicated to finding the ways. We don't know at the moment the best ways to create a much more care and share world. We don't know. We do know we've got serious problems in terms of toxic competitiveness, and males are suffering really badly, and they always have, with toxic competitiveness, and they do very harmful things. Okay, so I'm going to stop at that point. I'm going to thank Daniel once again for putting this on, making this all possible, and for his leadership. And back to you.
Thank you, Paul. Not an easy plight we have ahead of us. And I think part of what Paul has pointed out is that there are a lot of different areas that we need to address. And this is a call out for me and our initiative that those of you who are interested in getting involved, for example, with how do we spread more compassion to and from boys and men in early childhood education, in economics, in leadership. The devil's in the details, as has been said, but so is the angel. And so we really need to do some research and practice and form working groups, to understand the causes and conditions that lead not only to the challenges that we face, but also the opportunities that are ahead of us. All right, so with that, I'd like to introduce Danny Singley. Danny is a board-certified psychologist and director of the Center for Men's Excellence. His research and practice focus on men's mental health, with a particular emphasis on reproductive psychology and the transition to fatherhood. Dr. Singley is currently the president-elect of the APA's Division on Men and Masculinities. He's also one of my best buds. I love Danny, he's fun, and so I'm super happy to have you here, Dan, and look forward to hearing from you now. You're on mute, Danny, just in case you're interested.
Yeah, I was wrangling with the tech. Thank you, Daniel, and sending the love right back. And I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. It's such an important topic. And I want to build on some of the points that you and Paul just made. Top level, I think it is a fairly straightforward, no-duh statement that people of all genders struggle, and oftentimes we will struggle in gender-specific ways. That includes gender nonconforming, trans, female-identified, male-identified. And so in the context of this panel and this talk, as a subset of the ways that men struggle and struggle with others having trouble showing compassion to them and men experiencing self-compassion, I'm focused on fathers and some of the specific issues that the practical, the societal aspects of fatherhood can challenge that. So my research is on early fatherhood, the paternal perinatal mental health, the dude to dad transition. And generally speaking, if you ask folks, what is fatherhood about? They will say some version of to protect, to provide, and to sacrifice, all of which are noble aims. And when you stop and think about them psychologically, they're very externally focused, which is an ongoing distinction. It's a broad, in some cases unfair, but distinction about men being externalizers, women being more internalizers. Well, what I think is extremely important for the health of men and boys and fathers is to take that idea and to provide a bit more balance so that these fathers come to understand that, yes, protecting, providing, and sacrificing are incredibly important. And we also have the responsibility as fathers to be protected, to allow others that we love and that are close to us to provide for us. And I think in some cases, most importantly, to feel valued and allowing others to sacrifice for us as fathers. And this is an easy segue into the help-seeking research literature, which briefly, it's the old trope of, guys don't want to ask for help, directions, let alone help. Well, I want to start a little bit top level. Compassion fade is the social psychological principle that essentially says we only have about the capacity to truly care for about 150 people. And when you get away from one person, you can experience more of a sense of empathy and compassion. But the more people you start trying to have that compassion for, the actual experience of the compassion fades, which is why when one little girl falls down a well, the entire country can be enwrapped with it. And when a tsunami kills 5,000 people on the other side of the world, it's not good. However, true compassion and experience of it is a challenge. And the same thing happens when we start talking about compassion writ large for fathers or for men. And in a way, we have largely feminized the idea, the experience of compassion. And in order to enact the kind of new fatherhood role, like I see fatherhood, in particular early fatherhood, as the tip of the spear in the ongoing reconstruction of modern manhood. Pretty much nobody stands up and says, you know what, don't be involved, Dad, take a pass. However, what being involved means looks very different now than it did 50 years ago. And so being emotionally available, being a good partner, staying home to change diapers, soothing, swaddling, bathing, all of these which as a society we have generally determined and learned is the purview of the birthing parent. In order to enact that role, dad has to go against the man box. And Paul just really nicely laid out why that can be very, very tricky and aversive. Asking for help is one of these times, is one of these aspects of the period, particularly of early fatherhood, that is particularly tricky when what we're told is protect, provide, sacrifice. Nobody tells fathers you will need support. I work with the perinatal educators, with the pregnancy educators, and virtually no one tells us that. And unfortunately, that sets up a circumstance where oftentimes when they struggle, these fathers don't have compassion for themselves. They feel less than and end up trying to get all of our intimacy needs met by our partner. And it doesn't matter how great he, she, or they are, that is going to fall apart. And so that bit about feeling conflicted, I don't think it's a very difficult statement to say that generally speaking, men enjoy a one-up position relative to women writ large in terms of privilege and cultural power. And moving into certainly the early parenthood period, pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, many men will experience for the first time being second class, being seen as needing to step back, not being the competent voice in the room. All the while, we as a society are saying, get in there, dad, be involved, change diapers, be a good partner, emotional load, mental load, like, don't be a direct report, be a manager. And this feeling of, okay, I know that I carry with me privilege, yet at the same time, there aren't really classes for dads. I don't really see much in the way of modeling about being a really good involved father of a baby is oftentimes a very tricky load for some of these new dads to manage. And that last point, we traditionally look to males to do. We look to males for what they do, for what we do, and fatherhood as well, instead of who we are. And I have this conversation over and over and over again with patients of mine and in consultation that in order to really see our value, we have to understand the value of who we are, of the being of a father, not just what am I doing for others. Now, another, I think, very important element of what can be tricky for fathers to experience not just compassion from others, but compassion within ourselves. There's this common phenomenon of the current coach, certainly my age, right? Your 49-year-olds, your 50-year-olds being caught in what we call the sandwich generation, in which we're navigating not just the identity and the role change to being a father of a child, but also of being a child, an adult child or son to our own fathers and our own parents. And managing the needs of those generations above and below is itself oftentimes a clear barrier to stopping and focusing on ourselves. and showing ourselves the compassion. We may have lots of compassion to show for others. The question is, are they showing to us? And are we taking that in? Is that being mirrored for us so that we can have self-compassion? And the conflation of vulnerability with weakness is something we as a society have to tease apart. We have to disaggregate, because vulnerability is inherent in close relationships. I cannot have a close relationship with my child, with my partner, with my parent without vulnerability. There's no such thing. However, if I conflate that with weakness, then I will resist it, and we need that. So, looking at this, this point about dads accepting compassion from others and developing it ourselves, we have to dare to be important, to feel important to others in terms of who we are, in terms of our being, not just what we do for others, because we can discount that. If I did this for you and now I'm important to you, it's because of that, not because of me. And I don't mean to sound like, Yoda here or esoteric. To look at a being, as a father, as a being, transcends the protect, provide, sacrifice. And some of these barriers, is it okay to do that? That's cocky. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. The conflation of self-compassion with pity. And so, top level here, I think that working to help fathers to balance the externalizing and the protecting and providing, and the need to be protected, the need to be provided for, the need to allow others to sacrifice for us. So really concretely, what do you do about this? This is not rocket science, and fine, the shrink thing. So let's talk about feelings. But what do you do with a father, with any father? Go to them and say, hey, Dad, how are you doing? Pause. Wait for the platitude. It's all good. It is what it is, blah, blah. Pause. Eye contact. Okay. Now, how are you really doing? Show that you want to know, that you care about his inside, his internal. And we need to have knowledge. Like I'm in this every day. I focus on fathers and men's issues, but for us as the people that are out there on the front lines, knowing what are the local resources for these fathers who struggle, be it the early perinatal, 1 in 10 dads gets postpartum depression, major depressive disorder. 1 in 5 gets an anxiety disorder, not just a little bit of stress. There are resources. Postpartum Support International for the early dads, knowing who are the people that are sensitive in your community and being able to point them to them. And to understand that fatherhood is not just a status. It's an identity that goes on and on and on and rolls and has multidimensionality and nuance to it. And for those of you that are interested in getting involved, some colleagues and I developed the International Fathers Mental Health Day about 7-8 years ago. And it's a way to draw attention to some of the unique issues that fathers can experience in the transition to fatherhood and in early fatherhood. And it's coming up. It's actually this coming Monday. It's always the Monday after Father's Day in the United States and the UK. This year, it's aligned with Juneteenth. And so we're looking at Black fathers and Black masculinity. And then I also want to draw attention to a colleague of mine, Jed Diamond, has an effort called the Moonshot for Mankind. And it's a very straightforward program, which says men are dying too soon and are having lower qualities of life. And if you want to have more information about how to get involved, that group of men includes fathers. I encourage you to go check out some of the information about the Moonshot. And that's what I got for you. I'll happy to send out the slides and looking forward to hearing questions.
Thank you so much, Danny. I really appreciate that. And I think that the work in fathering is so important. And essentially, on some level, what we're talking about is de-objectifying men. Because ironically, if guys are the most powerful, privileged and everything, there's some way that we're looked at as doers, not beers. And essentially, when you actually are curious about the insides of guys, essentially they will start to come out and show those. One of the things I've found in leading men's groups and workshops over a bunch of different decades is that when guys feel safe, they will reveal their vulnerabilities and they will have the courage to reveal those vulnerabilities. And essentially, that's part of changing this male paradigm. And I'm excited that there are so many different organizations that are involved in doing so. All right, so we're on to our next presentation, and I'd like to introduce two women who are a part of the American Psychological Association on men and masculinities. Holly Sweet is a practicing psychologist and the first past president of the APA's Division on the Psychology of Men and Masculinities. She's a co-founder of the Cambridge Center for Gender Relations, a consulting firm dedicated to improving relationships between women and men in the educational and professional settings. Holly is editor of Gender in the Therapy Hour, Voices of Female Clinicians Working with Men. And she's also a dear friend and a lovely human being and someone who I've collaborated with at this point for years, and I look forward to many more years of collaboration. I'd also like to interview Erica Liebman, who is a clinician who specializes in trauma-related disorders. And actually, much of what we're talking about is related to trauma. That's the next panel, perhaps. And couples work in males psychology. Prior to Erica worked for a decade in the automotive racing and mechanical industries. Her experience of working with predominantly male colleagues informs and influences her perspectives in male psychology. And Erica, I've met you in the last 9 months, 10 months, and it's been an absolute delight. And I'm so happy to have you as part of our initiative. So with that, I will leave it to the two of you. Look forward to your presentation.
All right, wonderful, thank you. Right. So as Dana said, I'm Dr. Erica Liebman, and I'm presenting with Holly Sweet, and we're going to be discussing how women can serve as allies to men. So first, just the standard dictionary definition of an ally, pretty straightforward. It's a supportive association with another person or group. It's important to know that the definition of an ally in today's socio-political sphere is different than this definition in the dictionary that you may be familiar with. So I just want to kind of tag that. But for the purposes of the presentation today, our definition of an ally is someone who has a compassionate approach towards men of all backgrounds. So just keep that in mind. So the first thing you want to probably ask is, what do men think? What do men think of how women can serve as allies to men? So I turned to the pages of Reddit, and if you don't know what Reddit is, don't worry. It's another one of these social media apps. There are so many. I don't know what they all are myself, but I did find Reddit a few years ago. And what it is basically online discussion forums. You can find like basically topics, like any topic you want, go on. Start having conversations with people. And so I posted the question on the Ask Men thread, which was exactly the question: how can women serve or be allies to men? And I was shocked. I got 989 unique responses to this question. I was so popular for a day. I lived it up and really enjoyed every minute of being popular. And so with those 989 responses, I coded it into 5 different themes. And so I'll read to you those themes, how women can serve as allies to men. So the first thing that we can do, according to men, is to stop focusing on superficial attributes. And this with both like physical attributes and also using cultural cliches and terms that are kind of superficial, referring to men. The second is to not see men as a monolith. So if you've had a bad experience with one or a few men, not assume that all men are the same. Of course, we do have like our cultural stereotypes, and some of them for good reason, about men, but we also have to kind of tease apart what is one person's experience with one person and not the whole group. The next is to call out other women who are disrespectful of men. Men talk quite a bit about how there are situations where they wanted to stand up for themselves or other men, and that it just was not appropriate to do so, but that it would have been appropriate for another woman to do so. Fourth is to recognize that some men may express emotions differently than men. Now, while we certainly want to create spaces for men to open up and speak up and in ways that are good for their emotional and physical health, we can't assume that all men are the same and all men are going to express themselves exactly like women. There is a range and diversity within men, and we have to respect that. And finally, is to allow men to express emotions that may be difficult for women to hear. And so men talked about opening up to some women and, you know, overcoming the barriers of speaking up only to be like shut down or not heard, and how that was like a really difficult experience for them. So now I'm going to pass it along to Dr. Sweet, who's going to talk about some of the barriers of compassion towards men.
So just a quick thought, which is, first of all, 51% of humanity is female. If we don't engage women in this process, we're missing 51% of the population. So we're really looking at how do we get women as allies? How do we involve them in the process of more compassion for men suffering? There are three, and actually I think four basic parts. One is the cultural influence. Our culture is largely patriarchal. The culture, I think social media, news is focused on men acting badly. And I think we're surrounded in a culture where just men are seen as acting badly. And news doesn't there's no news about good men, unfortunately, not as much. I think we lack knowledge. Women lack knowledge of how men suffer. I think women may think that men have it all. They have all the power and privilege. I don't know that they recognize that men really suffer. And I think Danny talked about this as well, that men have to be in kind of in a straitjacket. They can't show emotions. They have to be strong and dominant. They can't be vulnerable. They can't ask for help, but they appear to have all the power and privilege. So I think it's hard to see that. The third thing is a negative personal experience with men. Many women have been unfortunately sexually or physically abused by men. Women have been demeaned, objectified, ignored, or they've seen a woman or women as recipients of this. And if you have been abused or if you've been ignored, it's hard to be compassionate towards men because you may go from a negative transference. One last thought that's not in here, which is how do we get women interested in men? Women just may not be interested in men's issues. I asked a friend about that. She said, well, that's your thing. That's your thing. I don't care. So trying to get women interested in why it's important that we have compassion for men is really important. So I want to talk about two specific examples, different settings that I've been involved with, about how it might work, about how, like in this case, a clinician can be more compassionate, can help a man feel safe. And we talked before about safety. And I think it's incredibly important that men feel safe in certain environments, because if they don't, they're going to shut down or leave. So say you have a female clinician, male client, and they're teaching, she's teaching something, this is a female clinician with a male client, and they're working together. First session, she may assume, based on her training, that talk therapy is best. She may not know much about men's issues, about how it might be hard to come to therapy. And she may just have no training in different styles of doing thought other than talk therapy. So she may come in with kind of this one size fits all, which is sort of a why can't men be more like women? Apologies to Rex Harrison, but it may be more along those lines rather than just, so she may be kind of stymied in how this works. And what can help, obviously, is familiarity with psychology of men. I think actually all clinicians need to have training in this, and it's not part of our training often, internships, but it really needs to be. And really being able to access different types of therapy, maybe getting outside your comfort zone. So you can do things like coaching or outdoor activities. There's a great book called Breaking Barriers to Working with Men. And it's really good. It looks at all these different therapies that we could utilize. So it's important to really say men may enter therapy, very different style, and we really have to adapt to this style. The client doesn't adapt to us, we adapt to them. So in educational settings, there's a kind of an unfortunate common feeling of you don't belong here. Men feel it, in women, it's like women's courses, men can feel it in gender courses, and one of the problems is that the curriculum for gender studies, and I've looked at this fairly extensively, tends to focus more on women and what's harmful for women, and then a little bit less on men and maybe how men harm women. We talk about men having the power and privilege, and not so much about how men suffer. So if a man goes into that class, he can feel ashamed, blamed, ignored, or actually what can happen is that he may say something that's not PC or woke, and he can get slammed for it. So he may feel unsafe, plus he may be the only man in the class, making him feel less safe. So what can help above all is making him feel safe. How do you do that? You get your curriculum, so it really says, we're going to pay attention to men. Men suffer too. Here's the restrictions on men. You want to make sure that men sign up for the course. How do you do that? You make the syllabus male friendly. A man comes into a class, he says something that's not PC. He starts to get nailed. You stop. You maybe break into breakout groups. You say, no, let's hear his opinion. It's important to look at it. And so this safety from men, I think, is huge. And a lack of understanding from women is, I think, also huge. So it's really on us as women to educate ourselves about what men go through. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Erica in a second. But this is where I think we get stuck, because women kind of say, well, why should we worry? It's not our thing, or men need to figure it out. We're not going to help them. So we're not going to look at some ways that we can help and move forward. So turning it over to Erica.
So in terms of public education, one of the first steps is public awareness campaigns. You think about people not being educated on certain topics, and the best way to do it is to give them some of the information. So I would be hard pressed to imagine that most men or women are aware of some of the mental and public health challenges facing men. And so, by the way, like, Happy Men's Health Month, this is part of public awareness. Another way is potentially getting information out through the NFL. Like, the NFL is a very male dominated field, but it also attracts a lot of women. So using some of these platforms as ways to educate the public so that they can potentially have compassion. The next is to recruit female public figures as role models. Somebody that comes to mind pretty immediately is someone like Michelle Obama. She's very well respected by many people and could serve as someone who could really speak on men's issues and really kind of engender compassion and understanding, so that women can kind of walk alongside men while they're doing their own work. And finally is to start a Women as Allies to Men think tank. This discussion of women being allies to men, I don't think that this is a very widely had conversation, and it certainly can be a sticky conversation. So we really need to kind of figure out, what are some of the impediments to compassion? How can women be a part of the picture? This is really building something that really is new. So if you'd like to be a part of this think tank, men and women alike, my contact information is on the next slide, along with Holly.
So I'm just going to finish with academic education and trainings. I think this is a much easier process than public education, because there's sort of a captive audience. So in graduate school, undergraduate schools, you can have more classes in the psychology of men. Not many programs still have that. They psychology of women, but not so much psychology of men. And I think that's really important. And we can manage that. There can be ways to do that. Specific outreach to different universities, APA can be involved. The second is when you're doing HR, educational, internship, diversity trainings, or freshman orientation, it's really important to include men's issues and to make sure there's a positive take on men. What can they do positively? Often these trainings are negative. This is what men do wrong, sexual harassment. This is why it's wrong. This is how women are victims. And men's ears they tune out, and they don't want to be seen as perpetrators, or they don't want to be seen in negative light. So it has to be more positive. And I think if you had men involved with the trainings, and the trainings were always led by men and women, it would be easier. And then finally, we need to conduct research on what helps or hinders women from being allies with men. It's important that we really understand what hinders them, because I think so many women are responding to what we talked about before, the culture, their own personal experiences, lack of information, and lack of interest. So how do we engage women if any of those things are true? They don't care, or they just, men, you have to do your own work. So I think it's important to really think about, how do we engage women? How do we get them engaged? Once they're allies, I think there are different ways that this can be done, but how do we get them there in the first place? So the last piece is feel free to contact us, either of us, about the work that we're doing in helping women be allies to men. And I'd like to end with a quote. And I think it's really important just in general about compassion. So let us be kind one to another, for most of us are fighting a hard battle. And I think if we realize how that hard battle that men face, women understand them more, it may be easier to be compassionate and kind.
Mm.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. That was a lovely presentation. And I highly recommend getting involved with them because we need a lot of women to be involved with this movement for sure. So our last presenter is Saeed Hill, who is a counseling psychologist at Northwestern University, where he focuses on healthy masculinity by developing and implementing strategies to improve masculine engagement in the prevention of violence. He also consults with organizations and companies throughout the US on improving healthy male engagement. And with that, I'd love to introduce you to Saeed. And Saeed, it is yours to take it away. I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And I just want to give a shout out to Daniel too, again, for your leadership, Daniel, and mentorship. So Daniel is one of my mentors and someone I deeply love. And so just appreciate this opportunity to be with you all today. Let's hold on. Let me get that right. All right. Can y'all see what I'm seeing?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, we're rocking. So today I'm talking to folks just about boys in particular and the struggles that our boys are having in school, but in our various learning environments. And so I wanted to set the tone with talking about boys' struggles and framing the issues of what our boys are experiencing right now in school environments and different learning environments, but also with the idea that compassion is really going to be a key point to how we address these issues. And so I like to start off with just humanizing all of this. And that's a picture of me as a child, as a boy. And I think in a lot of ways, we'll see the ways that we sometimes show up and treat boys developmentally is from a place of lack of compassion, a lack of love, a lack of affirmation, and it can be quite harsh the ways that we are with boys. And so I don't know. I some people might consider me a cute kid, but it's hard to be maybe not compassionate to a child who looks like that, right? And I think what I think about is what are the ways that we sort of maybe lack compassion even for ourselves. And how does that filter into how we treat boys? And so I encourage folks, what I've started to do is carry a picture of myself as a child on my own phone, just to have with me when I'm feeling less than compassionate to myself or less compassionate to others, because I think a lot of us are wounded. A lot of us are wounded children, and we're just in bigger bodies now, and we're still struggling with a lot of those same things. And so I just want to frame that and ground us with that. I wanted to start with framing some just key academic issues that boys are facing. So, globally, we're seeing that by the time that boys are moving through, and children in particular are moving through the first couple of years of school, we're seeing that a lot of these issues globally have taken over, where we're finding boys out of school for various reasons. So you can see here that more than half of our global school youth population is out of school, who are boys. And so that's even more, it's superseded girls at this point. And so there's a number of reasons for that, but many of that is going to be framed around familial sorts of responsibilities, but also lack of access to resources, whether that be things like healthcare, for example, working internet, water, basic needs. And so what I really appreciated about Dr. Gilbert talking before was this idea of, we're talking about compassion, we're talking about all these things that we need, but thinking about the hierarchy of needs, it's really hard to empathize or emphasize some of these things that we need or get these resources in there when the basic needs aren't being met, which have to do with basic resources. We also know that this contributes to some of these test scores being lower. We know that girls are doing better in school overall, regardless of subject, even in STEM subjects. And we know that boys are also more likely to have learning disabilities and learning challenges. And so we're seeing an academic issue now where boys are very much falling behind. And this has been the case for decades now. And it continues to widen given things like COVID-19. So aside from the specific academics, which is fine, I like to get into some stuff around the school experience of boys as well. So what we see from observations of our teachers, for example, and parents is girls are often more engaged with studying and learning activities. They also tend to have a stronger sense of belonging and esteem, and a collective sort of attitude with each other than boys do. We also know that disciplining is a big piece of what also contributes to boys' lack of belonging and acceptance within schools, where especially around things like race, boys are tend to be much more punished than girls are, for example. And Black African American boys, boys of color, are often more likely to be punished harshly than their white counterparts. And so you see that there's just a lot of these layers to what's going on with our boys and how they are impacted by this, especially around achievement gaps. And so our boys are really suffering in their school experience. And especially as we went remote in many different areas and locations that have the ability to do that, you have to consider a lot of the issues that were plaguing boys in schools to begin with have now been exacerbated by the online platform, because now there's less maybe guidance, even less hands-on influence from teachers, educators, parents, guardians, and those sorts of things. I also want to plug here through Division 51, the Task Force on Boys in Schools. If people are interested in this kind of information and interested in understanding more about boys in school and their experiences, I'd encourage people to check out that site. I'm part of that group as well, that task force. And so folks can get more information from there as we put together different fact sheets for educators and others who want to learn more about this issue. So things to know about this, though, as we're sort of framing these issues, is that boys and their behavior is a big topic of conversation with folks that I work with. So I primarily work with college men, but I run mentorship programs with young boys in the Chicago community, in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. And so what we kind of see here when we look developmentally with our boys behaviorally is that many of our boys are showing up in ways that are higher levels of externalizing behaviors. So we do see more fighting, aggression, yelling, maybe inattention and impulsivity. And we see a lack of patience many times with adults with these boys. And so we start to label these behaviors. We start to label boys as bad and these behaviors as bad. And we attribute this label to boys, even without thinking through, well, what is the reason? What are the reasons for this? Are we just assuming that boys are just inherently monsters? Well, sometimes we're treating boys like they are. But are we really asking questions about sadness? What is going on with boys at home, potentially? Are we asking about insecurities? Are we checking in around what is hurtful or painful for these boys? And also, maybe they're just being kids. That's another thing where sometimes we really want to treat children as if they're adults and we hold them to all of the high standards that we might, a 35-year-old such as myself, when sometimes kids are kids and they need to be learned, taught, and guided and loved, right? How do we hold boys and their behaviors accountable through love as opposed to punitive measures, right? So again, another misunderstanding of even how depression works is that depression doesn't look like it does in adults as it does in children. So oftentimes some of these behaviors that are more externalizing may be coming from a place of depression, but they look this way because boys and developmentally our brains aren't able to process through that in ways that we can often as adults. We also see in ways, especially in the around the United States, we see based on things like socioeconomic status. So what is the monetary situation for our boys? And especially for our boys of color, we see that though those sorts of items might also impact our boys' behaviors. We're also not really talking about trauma. I really appreciate Holly and Erica getting into some of that. But is there physical, emotional abuse happening, neglect, and maybe household instability? And so are we asking the right questions when we're forming relationship with our boys, when we're trying to teach them? We're also really not talking about some of the ways that the biology just may impact boys too, developmentally. And so these are all things. Now, we've heard a lot here about things like toxic masculinity as a term. I prefer to use the term restrictive masculinity as a way of understanding that masculinity is not inherently toxic, and those traits aren't necessarily inherently toxic. But what they can be is very restrictive, especially when we expect boys and then men to behave in very specific, rigid ways, just to be labeled as worthy men. And so, what we want to do is not label masculinity or boys as toxic, which is a big message that many of our boys are receiving, is that they're toxic. Their way of being or their identity as masculine or masked people is toxic. What we want them to see is we want them to be able to unrestrict, have more options for how to show up in the world as boys, as men. Can we affirm boys who step outside of, as Danny was talking about, the man box, right? Can we celebrate that and affirm that, as opposed to punishing you for it and trying to get you back in line by putting you back in the box? So we're just trying to help boys unrestrict. And I think there's many ways that we can go about doing that. And so again, we can keep going on about all of these different things. We can talk about how we start punishing boys so early, as opposed to treating them like children and human beings who are learning. And so we start to put boys more in timeout. We isolate boys early on in their lives. 3 and 4-year-olds. Think about that boy that you saw in the very first slide. That's me being isolated, right, at 3 years old, away from peers, and not be having the brain development to understand what that means. And what does that develop in me, right? Maybe that then starts to develop an anxious attachment, an insecure attachment. And so we have to really think about, how are we affirming our boys? How are we loving our boys? And what's going on with ourselves internally? And so I think that's what comes where the self-compassion and the compassion piece comes in, where compassion is a Latin word to suffer with, right? And are we suffering? Are we understanding the suffering and the experience of our boys? And so if we're talking about being compassionate, confident, loving, secure, patient, if we're trying to develop this in our boys, how are we showing up with our boys? Are we showing up in those ways? Boys need guidance. Boys need modeling, and not just modeling from just anybody, but modeling with those people that are they have the most influence with them, our educators, our parents, our guardians, our peers. Can we do those sorts of things? So maybe it just starts with those items. But to Dr. Gilbert's point, can we also create the conditions for it? So for example, are we managing classrooms in a way that's conducive to these sorts of ideas? Or are we expecting our boys just to sit on their hands all day, for example? So something that I'll also offer to folks is asking yourselves, how do you treat yourself with compassion? Because a lot of the times what I see reflected with some of these adults working with children is that a lot of those internal pains and struggles are then projected onto kids, onto children, onto our boys. And so part of what also comes up is asking yourself, have boys hurt you in your life, in your past? Have men hurt you? And that's okay to acknowledge that and have feelings about that. But understanding and processing through, how does that then inform your way of being as you develop our boys, right? And so compassion is very gender neutral. And so it's not even that we think of compassion as a feminine trait, it's that we don't think of compassion as a masculine one. And that's not the case whatsoever. And so some of the last things that I'll leave you with is things like targeting belonging with our boys in school. So we need to first acknowledge that our boys are struggling, but are teachers going above and beyond in some ways? I think what people don't want to hear is that it may take more work. Culture change is not a thing that you can put in the microwave and just have in 30 seconds. Culture change takes really significant intentional time. And so that means sometimes reaching out to students after hours, letting them know that you see them, that you hear them, that you care about them. Maybe that means mandatory office hours for some of our kids, or time with teachers. And that goes for parents as well. And so we need to create those environments. Being more warm, demanding. We have such low expectations for our boys, and we need to raise those expectations for our boys, but we need to do so in an affirming way. Tough love doesn't go so far as maybe a warm, demanding way does, right? We can be warm, affirming, and then still hold us accountable. And we need to do a great job with that. Lisa Delpit is really great for that in some of the culturally relevant pedagogy. I'd check that out. And then lastly, can we tie our boys and their learning to the real world outside of that classroom, especially with a lot of our boys of color or our boys who struggle with their role in their families and may have elevated roles and responsibilities with their families. We need to show them how their education will also help with their familial responsibilities, how it helps build the environment, and how it can help mentor other boys. And so I'll give this link here about this article about some of the key elements. Feel free to use this. I can put it in the chat. But these give some other ideas more around policy and procedure. How do we revamp academics? How do we revamp curriculum to be more gender aware, to address some of the restrictive ways we treat our boys? And so I leave you with a picture of me and my family with folks who really love me, and really try to help me unrestrict in my life. So, and there's my email too for folks. So that's what I have for y'all.
Great. Thank you so much, Saeed. And a pleasure to hear you. And for sure, one of our working groups will be about boys in school and boys in early education, specifically with the theme of, and the meme of really, how do we really spread compassion to these boys rather than callousness and sometimes even cruelty. So those of you who are interested in this territory, you're going to want to send us your contact information, and we will contact you as we start forming these groups. Okay, so with that said, I'd like all of the panelists to be highlighted. And for those of you who have questions, if you will use the reaction button, raise hands, and I will recognize you. Please, if you're asking a question, to not go on a long discourse about it, to ask your question in 1 or 2 sentences. Interesting enough, we don't have a bunch of questions in the chat at this point. So if you want to put your question in the chat, feel free to. Or you can use the raise hand and I'll recognize you. It may also be that you guys are so awesome as panelists that no one had any questions. You answered everything before they even had a question. Well, we actually have a panelist who has a question, and that's all fine. Hey, Holly.
I'm going to get it started just to say that Eric and I thought about ways in which we can help women get started. And there's, some very simple ones, but one of the main ones is acting as role models for other women. So we really believe that we as women can be active bystanders and can really help with women who are being hostile to men. We can really make a difference. Just want to point that out. And other women can in this presentation, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. So unless I'm not seeing it, I don't see anyone with a raised hand. Is that accurate?
I think
Yeah,
Mark
there are-
Sherman has his hand raised too.
I guess I'm not seeing that. Okay, Mark. Go
Yeah,
for
but he's not able to unmute, I think. Oh, there he is.
All right. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Daniel, for work and putting this together. It was great. And I want to thank all the panelists who were fantastic. But I want to give a special shout out, well, to Saeed, who I loved hearing what he had to say, but particularly to Holly and Erica. And this really isn't a question. I do absolutely believe that the support of women in trying to call attention to these issues is important. And I know, for example, in graduate programs, men often do feel not being attended to, or if they say one thing that's not considered PC or woke, they get in trouble. So I do believe personally that is an incredible path to go. Yeah. But it requires courage and bravery. So I want to thank you, but I want to thank all the panelists. That was it. I don't really have a question.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. And I also want to really leave it open to any of you panelists. You heard each other's presentations. You may have questions or reflections from what you've heard and what you've taken in.
Daniel, there was a question on the chat in regards to early punishments of boys. How do we empower the parents to approach parenting with more validation? That was put in during Saeed's presentation.
Great, thank you.
There are also 2 hands raised, Brett and Robert Gelda.
Okay, I am not seeing those, so, okay, all right. Do you want to address that question first, Saeed, and then I'll recognize Brett?
Sure. Yeah. I would be also curious to hear Danny's take on this too, from a fatherhood perspective, if you're open, Danny. But I think a lot of what I've encouraged with for parents is some of their own internal work. I mean, honestly, with some of their own patients. So it's sort of been, how do you sit with your own discomfort? What comes up for you when your child, for example, is just misbehaving, right? What actually comes up for you? And what I see from a lot of parents is that they act on the anger, where they sort of tap into almost their own childlike wounds in the moment. And it's sort of like they're acting and matching a child attitude in that moment and the emotion of a child. So I think for a lot of my parents that I work with, I sort of talk about taking that deep breath, taking it in to sort of re-regulate, and think to yourselves, like, what is the learning here for this child in this moment? What do I want to get across to them? And then depending on what feels more age appropriate, sitting with them in it. So for some examples, we've had some parents just be on the floor with their child in a tantrum and be on their level with them, right? And just kind of be with them to let them know that you're not going anywhere. You're there with them, and you may not even be trying to calm them down. Maybe let them cry it out a little bit. Let them be in it. Just let them know you're with them. Sometimes it's as much as holding your child. One thing I didn't mention a lot is how we stop touching and holding like boys' hands. We stop hugging boys much earlier than girls, right? And so and boys are often developmentally taken from, if we're thinking evolutionary, from their mothers earlier, right? And we start doing things where we start the lack of compassion early with boys. And so I think that that's a piece of this too. So Danny, I'm not sure if you had anything that you'd want to say about that, but I was just curious.
I mean, really briefly, I love what you said. In particular, Saeed, I love that you directly expressed your love for Daniel, right? Like somebody made that comment in the chat, and that is what we need more of, and it's really authentic. And I love you too, guys. Briefly, just in terms of a resource, there's an old school book that's not really about compassion, but it is a direct application of solid behavioral modification principles, and it's called Parents Are Teachers. And I put that in the chat. And an important part of that is it involves being mindful about catching kids being good, not just punishing problematic behaviors. And so I throw that out there as a resource. I don't want to get too much further into it, but to go off of Saeed's point, could not agree more. For parents doing our own work, I was literally yesterday, I had several different dads in my office that when they were upset with a child, they looked angry. But then when we get under that, it is all insecurity and shame and fear of failure. So for us as parents to have that and to have that knowledge, that's what really empowers us to be present in a way that can empower.
Great. Thank you so much, Danny. Okay, Brett, would you be willing to turn on your video and certainly obviously your audio?
All right, I'm taking the plunge here. Okay.
All right.
So, question regarding empathy versus compassion. I feel that, they're very related, but kind of hearing more of compassion being more of a actionable item, whereas I guess for my own personal experience, empathy often is like I'll recognize there's a need and try to solve it versus really understanding what that need is. So I was just wondering if you guys could maybe dive into that a bit, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. So you see the difference between empathy and compassion. Compassion is a motive, and the motive's being organized in a certain kind of way. Empathy is a competency, it's an ability, it's a skill. And you can use empathy in many ways. You can use empathy for compassion, but you can also use empathy if you want to be vengeful, deceitful. If you can understand how to manipulate the minds of others, you've got it made, I suppose. So empathy is a competency, and we teach it in various ways, whereas compassion is a motivation, it's a desire, it's an inner wish.
Daniel, there's a question in the chat. Can any of the panelists recommend reading on how to use compassionate empathic, positive reinforcement versus tough love for young boys?
Great question. Anyone have anything
What-
in mind?
One that I really enjoy is John Kabat-Zinn wrote a book on mindful parenting, which which might seem like an oxymoron, but it isn't. And I think it really helps to sort of center and be with oneself, to then be more mindful and present, and have that side of ourselves to offer to our kids. I'll put a link in the chat.
It's interesting.
Daniel, you've got Robert Gebel.
Yes, I know that.
Waiting.
I'm going to get to Robert in a moment. I do want to say one thing, which is part of what I'm noticing just in the world these days, is people like Jordan Peterson, who has some valid points, but also comes from an old school view about, punishing children, and some of separating them if they're like not behaved, rather than loving them when they are. And I think part of what we're really looking at is how do we change this paradigm so that there's more caring and sharing, instead of going back to that old kind of autocratic, authoritarian way of parenting, and just generally being in relationships, and certainly in relationships with boys. All right, Robert, you're on.
Hi, Daniel, and your wonderful team. Thank you for presenting this fantastic seminar. So I'm a mindfulness teacher, and I do a lot of work on myself personally. I'm a father of a 4-year-old, and I've really noticed my own shadow come up as I become a father, and how that runs through my own experience, and I've had my own experience of childhood trauma and so on, and it feels like it takes a lot of courage to do the inner work as a father.
Right.
Like real courage, real commitment, like one of your panelists was saying here, that kind of commitment to understanding the causes of suffering, and in this case trauma. So I'm just curious if, and this is not aimed at any panelist in particular, but what's the impact? What do you think is the impact of trauma, early trauma, and how that kind of then expresses itself in terms of toxic masculinity? Or just curious what your views on that.
Well, that seems like a very easy question to answer. Very, very, very simple, not complex. I'm going to take a first blush at it, and I want to open it up to other folks. When you think about trauma, ultimately what's underlying trauma is threat. And we think about creating safety versus threats, unmitigated threats automatically psychobiologically activate defensive reactions. We are not different from other mammals in that regard. So when we think about that, it's like it's fight, flight, freeze, appease, some variations of those. And so essentially we have to create a sense of safety. And when you think about traumatized boys in this regard, they often act out. There's a saying that hurt boys hurt others. And when they start acting out, what happens, right? They get punished. What happens then? It drives them deeper into that threat defense system. And I think that we really need to change our understanding about this. There's an, excuse me, there's an amazing TED talk about this would-be school shooter. He was very depressed, he was overweight, he was rejected, isolated, excluded in a multitude of different settings, and increasingly he got angry. This is actually part of what underlies all these male shootings that are occurring, which is another thing that we really want to be addressing through our initiative. And what happened was a kind of quasi-friend actually showed him compassion. And what happened? Something opened up in him, and he chose to not do it. And here he is years later, married, 4 children, talking about this. This is what we need. We have a culture, a world that is so focused on punishment and not understanding that the immediate response is such that we create more suffering. And so part of what we really need to do in terms of changing the paradigm is to infuse compassion into it. That's why I'm a believer in the Global Compassion Coalition, and certainly what we're doing through them. And we welcome your involvement in terms of how do we do this? I don't want to say boots on the ground, because interesting that that's also part of that kind of crazy system, but more, love on the ground, and love, caring, and kindness on the ground.
Daniel, I know there are only 2 minutes, but there's a question I want to put out, so maybe somebody can respond quickly. I am curious, when living in a country where women's autonomy and rights are being removed, the United States, how do we foster compassion in women to support men and their mental health? Unfortunately, the majority of persons who rule on these decisions are men, not to say women aren't involved too, because they are as well. How do we fight the notion of us versus them?
That should only take a few seconds to respond to, right? Holly, Erica, do you think either of you want to jump into that?
Want to do this?
I think we probably can both comment. I mean, my first knee-jerk response is that, those few men don't represent all men, right? Kind of going back to the survey. I know a lot of men who don't feel the way that those men do. That being said, men have legislated, right, a lot of things that women have done. So there are some of these barriers to compassion, right, that Holly talked about. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just think it's, you remember that quote about they came for so-and-so and I didn't care, and finally someone came for me and there is no one to care. I think we're all in this together. So women support men, men support women. We need to work together. And the question is, what are the barriers to doing that? And how do we get past that? That's the work then Eric and I really feel very strongly about. There are a lot of people that can help. So we need to work together, heal our wounds, and then support each other in dealing with these very difficult times that are really are struggling. We're all struggling.
Yeah, and I also don't think it's mandated for people to have compassion for all people at all times, right? There are exceptions. Like there are people that you can be angry at and not have compassion for, right? Like it's a choice. But like I said, it's like, is it these specific people? Is it a specific men? Or does it get globalized that it's all men, like men are the ones doing this? Like I understand the historical implications, but I don't feel that these decisions represent the beliefs of all men. And just to keep that in the back of our minds as we think about these issues.
All right. Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists. You guys are all awesome, and you are awesome. And I do love all of you. And I'm happy that you've shown up, those of you who have. This is recorded, and there will be videos that come out, small videos, larger videos. And we really welcome you to be part of our movement. Individuals, groups, organizations, we really know that it's going to take a lot of us and a lot of energy to really create a paradigm shift. And we really do need to shift, because if we're going to even thrive, we need to survive, for starters. And I'd like to really end this with a quote from Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield, who said, "Our sorrows and wounds are healed only when we touch them with compassion." And so thank you all for being part of this, and may you be well, may you be healthy, may you be happy.